Hey everybody, welcome back to Football Talk with Vinny. So what we're going to do today, we're actually starting like a series of videos. I'm just going to go over and kind of recap what I think the teams should do individually in this offseason. Now I don't want to make it one long video, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually break it down by division. This way if you're just looking for your specific team, as I released a video that has your team in that division, you can just go to that specific video. So it makes it a little easier. Also, just for me, I can break them down kind of in that order. So that's how I decided to do it. So obviously with that being said, there are 8 divisions. There's 4 in the AFC, 4 in the NFC. So this is essentially going to be an 8-part series. So I figured we'll start it off really with the Super Bowl champ Buccaneers. So we're going to start with their division, which is going to be the NFC South. So we'll actually just get right into it and start with the Buccaneers first. So for the Buccaneers, obviously you just came off of winning the Super Bowl, so you are super excited about that. First championship since 2002. But for the offseason now, you are going to have some trouble because you do have a lot of players that are going to hit free agency this offseason. So the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, according to overthecap.com, have about $9 million to spend on players. But when you see that there are so many free agents, guys like Shaq Barrett, Levante David, Gronk, Ndamukong Suh, and Chris Godwin, to name a few, all of those guys are actually free agents. And again, with $9 million, you probably realistically can't sign any of them. Shaq Barrett's a pass rusher. He's probably going to get north of 16, 17 million. Chris Godwin is a wide receiver, probably going to get around the same, 15 plus million. Gronk, you might be able to re-sign. He is getting older. I think he only really wants to play with Tom Brady, so he may take less money to stay there. You know, Suh's a little different. He kind of signs like these short-term deals to try to maybe win a championship. He did that with the Rams a few years back and now with the Bucks. Levante David is a guy that you maybe can re-sign. The top end linebackers usually get around 10 to 12, 13 million. So you might be able to convince him to re-sign in Tampa and take maybe closer to that $9 million mark. But even then, that's going to be really tough because a lot of times what happens when you win the Super Bowl is all other 31 teams overpay for your players because in their minds, they're like, well, they got championship DNA, so let's bring them in and get them on our roster. So a lot of times when you win the Super Bowl, which is why it's hard to repeat, almost all your free agents leave because they just get so much money to sign in other places that it's almost doesn't make sense for the team to re-sign that player and overpay. As opposed to draft needs, obviously Brady still wants to play, so eventually you have to start thinking about the quarterback position. But if Brady says he's going to play this year and probably for the next couple years, maybe you address it in the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th round. Maybe, but definitely with your first round pick, I think it's probably a good idea to maybe just depends on who you bring back and who you don't bring back, right? If you don't bring back Chris Godwin, maybe it is a good idea to spend your first round pick on a wide receiver because then at that point, I guess if you bring back AB, you'll have Mike Evans and AB and you might want to re-sign another receiver or draft a receiver, at that point. If you don't bring back AB, then you really just have one receiver. But then again, on the defensive side, you're about to lose 2 defensive linemen, a D tackle, and a pass rusher, an edge rusher, and you're also going to lose one of your linebackers. So you might actually end up drafting on the defensive side of the ball, particularly the D line. So it's going to be a very tough offseason for the Buccaneers. Obviously, not too bad because when you have the Super Bowl championship, even if the offseason doesn't go as according to plan or you lose a bunch of players, it is what it is. It's kind of the cost of doing business, and that's what happens when you're a Super Bowl champ. Now for the New Orleans Saints, they are in a very tricky spot. They are $69 million over the cap, So they are going to have to essentially cut players, let alone all the free agents that they have. They almost can't sign any of them. And the players are actually on their roster. They're going to have to let some of them go in order to even free up money to get to a position where they can even afford to be under the cap. So obviously, they're going to have to probably end up restructuring guys that are on big-term deals. So maybe a guy like Cameron Jordan, maybe even talk to Michael Thomas about restructuring their deals to kind of push some of that money backwards, right? Because you do have a lot of dead cap with guys like Drew Brees. So next year, or after next year, that dead cap number, which I believe is about 22 million, it comes off. So if you can push some of those bigger salary contracts towards next year or the year after, you know, when Drew Brees' 22 million comes off the books, it'll kind of help alleviate some of that for you as well. So I think in terms of free agency, there's almost nothing that can be done here. You're actually going to have to lose some players, which is why I think I even talked about in the Deshaun Watson video. I think it would be a good idea if you're the Saints. Obviously, you have two options. You can trade some of your younger players like Marshawn Lattimore, Marcus Davenport, some of these guys that they're about to be free agents, so they're about to get big money. So what you could do is you could trade some of these players, and what you do is you now no longer have that salary on your books, so it kind of lowers your salary cap number, and maybe you get some draft picks. Now, if I'm the Saints, I would want draft picks not for this year, I'd want it for next year, because the whole point is you have to get under the cap. So if you draft a rookie in the first round this year, you have to sign him to a contract. So maybe if I'm the Saints, I look to trade players and get draft picks for next year's draft. Or again, like I said in the Watson video, you maybe trade 3 or 4 of those young pieces and bring in a guy like Deshaun Watson, who's only owed about $10.5 million for this year, so very manageable, and then his cap number spikes next year when his actual contract extension kicks in. If you want to hear me talk about that, I'll actually put a link to the description below in my Deshaun Watson video. You should go check that out. Obviously, after getting under the cap, which is going to be a very, difficult process, you now have to figure out life without Drew Brees, essentially, right? You did start Taysom Hill for a couple games last year. You did win a bunch of games when he was the starter, but he obviously did not look too great, and he hasn't really been a starting quarterback. Now, if you're Sean Payton, you gave him a bunch of money because you say you believe in him, so I guess we're going to see how that works. If they don't bring in another quarterback, we'll see how much faith he actually has in Taysom Hill. And then in terms of the draft, I think maybe drafting a quarterback in the first round might be smart if a guy like Mac Jones can fall to you. If not, I guess if you're the Saints, you still have a talented roster. So at this point, you're maybe just taking the best available player that drops to you. You are in a good position there where the Saints have built a very good team, which is why the last 2 years they were able to win a bunch of games when Drew Brees missed time, right? I think 2 years ago he missed the 6 games. Teddy Bridgewater went 6-0, I believe, in those 6 starts. So you've got a very good team, which is why you're able to win games, even though Drew Brees wasn't there the last 2 years. So, it's going to be difficult to get under the cap, but again, they're going to lose some players to get under the cap as well, or they're maybe going to have to restructure some deals. Obviously, you want to go the restructure route, but they're in a good spot to where if they can find the long-term answer at quarterback, they should be able to just pick up where they left off. Now you got the Atlanta Falcons. They are in a very tricky spot. They are actually $20 million over the cap. So they're going to have to cut some players just to get under the cap. They weren't a very good football team this year, right? So now they have no money to sign free agents. So how are they realistically going to get better? Now, obviously, they have a top 10 pick in the draft this year for winning only, I think, 4 games it was. But I think if you were the Atlanta Falcons, the very first decision is, what do you do with Matt Ryan? Now, I think there was a report earlier this month saying that they are not going to trade Matt Ryan, which doesn't really mean anything. The Texans have said they're not going to trade Deshaun Watson, but they kind of don't have a choice. And what else are you supposed to say? If they say they're actively shopping Matt Ryan, they may not get as much for him. And also, if you are going to trade Matt Ryan, does that mean you now trade Julio Jones as well? And then here's the really difficult part. So for Matt Ryan, his salary cap figures are, if you keep him, you pay him $40 million. If you were to release him or cut him, which they won't do, you have to pay him $49 million. And if you trade him, you actually owe him $44 million if you trade him in dead cap. So you're roughly around the same figures, whether he's on your team or not. But if you trade him, you're now paying $44 million to a quarterback that's not on your roster. And that is a huge chunk of the salary cap you're having to pay towards the quarterback position. And now, not only do you not have that guy, but you have to replace him with another quarterback who you're going to pay a bunch of money to. And the same thing with Julio Jones. Julio Jones' cap number is $23 million. If you cut him, it's $38. But again, you could find a trade partner. If you trade him, it's $23, so it's roughly the same if you trade him as if you keep him. But again, if you trade them both, you're talking about a $67 million dead cap hit. And if you're not sure what that means, I did make a video on just explaining the salary cap, so I'll actually put a link in the description below about that video as well. It's a very good video, you should check it out. But again, that's $67 million. The cap number projected to be around 180. So you're talking about a figure that's about 38% of your cap if you trade both of those players that you're spending, again, on players that are not even going to be on your roster. It's very difficult to spend almost 40% of your cap on 2 players to have a dead cap hit and then have to sign 53 players to your roster and you actually build a competitive team. But again, I guess if you did go that route, you probably can get at least a first-round pick for Matt Ryan, probably a first or second-round pick for Julio Jones. He's still an elite wide receiver. So at that point, if you did that route, yes, you're probably going to be very bad this year, but you are going to reset your budget essentially, right? You're going to take a huge cap hit number this year, but next year you're going to have a lot of cap space and you'll have a bunch of those first round picks, and you'll be able to kind of reset that way. If you decide to stick with Julio Jones and Matt Ryan and you're actually just going to retool, then obviously it makes sense to, once you get under the cap, you're going to have to essentially use your drafts to draft some defensive players. You need to get help on the defensive side of the ball. You need to be able to get some stops. If you can get some stops, that offense is still ridiculously talented. You have, essentially Pro Bowlers everywhere, right? And again, if you're trying to get under the cap, you're about 20 million over. So it's not going to be too hard to get over the cap. You could maybe restructure some guys like a Matt Ryan, Julio Jones, or also a Jake Matthews, their left tackle. He's due for about a $20 million cap hit. So again, you can maybe restructure some of those guys to try to get the cap number as low as you can to get over that, or to get just under that cap. But again, since they're 20 million over the cap, probably not going to be able to sign any free agents at this point, right? You're really just going to have to do a lot of work just to get under the cap. So their offseason is going to be pretty limited. The only real decision is, do they trade Matt Ryan and Julio Jones, or do they keep them? And then the last team in the division is going to be the Carolina Panthers. This one's actually more interesting, right? Because they actually do have $31 million of cap space. Obviously, their biggest probably decision this offseason is, what do they do at the quarterback spot? Right, there have been rumored to trade for a guy like Deshaun Watson, right? So if you get him, what kind of assets do you have to give up, right, to get him? And if you do bring him onto your roster, obviously you probably won't have much draft capital at that point if you get him. So that's pretty much going to be your offseason, right? You may be able to sign a player or two, but again, you have 31 million in cap space. If you bring him on, that's another 10.5. So now you're looking at about 20 million in cap space. Teams usually don't like to spend right up to the number, because again, if something happens, an injury happens, you have to re-sign a free agent. Now you kind of don't have any cap space. Or also, the way NFL cap space works is, if you don't use the money this year, it does roll over into next year. Again, if you're not familiar with it, it's all in that video that I did explain it on, so you should check it out. But again, if they don't use any of that money, it does roll over. So a lot of teams don't like to spend the money unless they're like realistically competing for a championship. Now again, if they decide not to go for a quarterback, you do have a couple options in free agency, because you would have $31 million. I think personally, maybe some free agents they should look at are some offensive linemen, some guys like Brandon Scherff. Not sure if I'm saying that name right. It's the guard from the Washington football team. If he doesn't re-sign a long-term deal there, he's been a Pro Bowl caliber guard for years. And if you can improve that offensive line, it obviously will help Christian McCaffrey be able to have more holes, right, and be able to make more better plays in the run game. Obviously, he was hurt last year, so that was unfortunate. But also for the pass game as well, right? If you're able to protect Teddy Bridgewater, you do have a lot of good receivers, a lot of young receivers, actually, in that Carolina Panthers organization. And then the difficult part is your free agents, the guys that are on your team that are going to be free agents. You have 4 offensive linemen. So you have both your tackles in Taylor Morton and Russell Okung that are both going to be free agents. And then you also have some guards, John Miller and Chris Reed, that are both free agents. So I think offensive line is definitely a position of need. So if you're going to re-sign some of those guys, that's great. If not, you do need to, I think, use some of that cap space to sign some offensive linemen. And then obviously in the draft, if you decide not to get a Deshaun Watson, right, maybe you do draft a quarterback with that first overall pick that you have. If maybe the 2 or 3 top quarterbacks get drafted by the time it's your pick, at that point, maybe you just take an offensive lineman, right? Maybe one of the linemen slip. If some of those teams ahead of you picked a quarterback, one of those tackles should slip and you take one of them. And maybe you look to take a quarterback in the 2nd or 3rd round, and you just hope that he can develop behind Teddy Bridgewater and in a year or 2 become the starter. So that's going to be it for this video. Obviously, it's probably 10-ish minutes long, which is why I'm going to break them up into different divisions and segments, because again, the video would be way too long if I went over all 32 teams. But thank you guys so much for watching the video, and I look forward to making another one on this series as well.